All right. So we are live. Thank you all for coming. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so excited to have you. My name is Alyssa and I work for The Word. We are a nonprofit organization with the mission of promoting voices from underserved communities and diverse backgrounds. Hence the wonderful speakers that we have today. We want to honor their stories of those who have faced adversity and injustice and to provide a sanctuary space where these groups can see themselves in literature. Thank you for joining, and I am happy to introduce Angela, who will introduce our wonderful speakers. And I'm gonna
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Good evening, everyone. And a huge thank you to our wonderful friends at The Word. We're always grateful to partner with y'all, especially these past, oh my God, it's almost 3 years now. It's been such an amazing virtual event series. And I thank you to everybody for joining us. I'm Angela Maria Spring. I'm the owner of Duende District, a collaborative pop-up bookstore by and for people of color where all are welcome. And we currently have pop-up boutique locations in Washington, D.C. and Albuquerque, New Mexico. And if this is your first time joining us, a little bit about what we do is the Duende Project is about the collective, the community, and creation and decolonization of literary spaces by and for people of color. And you can find out more by visiting our website at duendedistrict.com. You can sign up for our mailing list. We're also on Twitter and Instagram on @duendedistrict. And we try to do like 1 to 2 events a month, and we love to see you, and always are welcome to ideas for anybody if you are interested in having an event with us. So it is always a pleasure to welcome today's guests, Natalia Sylvester and Lupita Aquino. They've both been an essential part of the fabric of the Duende community for basically since the beginning. And it's also my honor to call them my friends. So how much talent and kindness and beauty they carry with them. And I know many of us are very heavy with grief and anger, especially right now. So I believe this event came together with perfect timing. I know I definitely needed to be here with you all so we can hold each other in this protected space. And to celebrate Natalia's gorgeous new book, the YA novel Breathe and Count Back from 10, which is a story that's very special to her. And I also feel is like a special gift to us all. She and Lupita will be in conversation after Natalia reads a little briefly, and please feel free to drop any of your questions in the chat box, and we'll also link to where you can buy the book with us. So on to the main event. Lupita Aquino, better known as Lupita Reads, is the co-founder and moderator for Lit on 8th Street Book Club, hosted at Solid State Books, and is a passionate reader, active in both the local and online book community through her Instagram blog at lupita.reads. And she is also a columnist for the Washington Independent Review of Books and a contributor for the Reading Women podcast. And she also has like an amazing newsletter, which I know there was a really wonderful interview with Natalia that just came through. So you should totally go check out everything she does. It's always amazing. I trust her words on books implicitly. And she's just adding so much to the community all the time. So yeah, definitely go check out Lupita in every avenue that you possibly can. And born in Lima, Peru, Natalia Sylvester is an award-winning writer of novels, essays, and poetry. Chasing the Sun was named the best debut book of 2014 by La Eternidad magazine, and Everyone Knows You Go Home won an International Latino Book Award and the 2019 Jesse H. Jones Awards for Best Work of Fiction for the Texas Institute of Letters. Her debut YA novel, Running, was a 2020 Junior Library Guild selection, and her sophomore YA Breathe and Count Back from 10 is out now from HarperCollins. Sylvester's essays have appeared in the New York Times, Bustle, Catapult, Latina Magazine, and McSweeney's Publishing, and have been widely anthologized. She received a BA in creative writing from the University of Miami and now lives and writes in South Florida. So take it away.
I just want to say welcome and thank you so much to Duende. Thank you, Angela. Thank you to the Word for hosting us. And most importantly, thank you to Natalia for writing and for doing this with us and for giving us your words. And as Angela mentioned, you're going to be reading for us, which is going to be so exciting and such a treat. So I'm going to stop talking because I can't wait.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Lupita and Angela and Alyssa. I'm just so excited. I'm so happy this came together, and thank you all three because it's just really an honor to be sharing this space with you all tonight. So I'm going to read a short passage from the beginning of the book. It's actually the beginning of chapter 7, I believe, is it? Chapter 6. But I like to read this passage because it's actually the first words I ever wrote of this book when it finally started coming to me. So, chapter 6. My whole life, they've explained it to me like I'm a child. Make a fist with one hand and cover it with the other. Pretend paper just beat rock. This is a normal, healthy hip in its socket, doctors say. Now move the fist out slowly, toward the edge of the hand that covers it, until it's barely hanging on by what looks like some miracle of gravity. This is my hip, not normal, not healthy, practically unhinged. Except not at all like a rock in a game of rock, paper, scissors, because that rock is supposed to be strong, and my bone is more like limestone, fragile and freckled with holes. The way they talk about it, sometimes I don't know how I'm still standing. How I'm literally standing is off. Chueca, crooked. I've never liked the word in either language. In Spanish, it's a tisk on your tongue, something to hide in shame. How dare my body not grow in a straight line? And why should it matter anyway, when so many things in nature, rivers and trees and shorelines and mountains, are free to be imperfect? No one calls a flower chueca as it bends its way towards the sky. Then there's the English, crooked cops, crooked bones, crooked politicians, crooked systems. My body gets lumped in with all of them, like it's morally wrong. Sometimes they've called it dislocated, except fixing it isn't as simple as snapping it back into place. The more technical term sounds like something you'd name a continent. Dysplasia, like a floating mass of land with no home. So I'll stop there.
I was like, how loud does it sound if you guys hear me clap? But I love that you read that part for many reasons. And we are going to get into a conversation portion. And I just want to let everyone know that you all will have a chance to also ask questions. So definitely have those prepared as you're listening to our conversation, because we'll do those at the later half of this. But just going back to that passage you read, as I was reading it myself, I deeply identified with it because, at least for that word and the way it's used, and almost kind of like to identify otherness, and I just thought that that was such a powerful moment for you to use words, and which is what you do throughout the book. Just could you talk to us about the definitions that each chapter starts with? So, for those who might not have opened or read the book yet, the chapters each come with a definition that is, I'll let you explain it.
Yeah, and actually, so the beginning of each chapter starts with a dictionary definition, and there's two versions of a definition for each word that kind of that's chosen for that chapter. And the first definition is the more, the dictionary definition we would find if we opened up any dictionary. The second one is labeled VR for Veronica's initials, and they're actually her versions of the definitions. And what it is that Veronica, when she was, she's been in and out of surgeries her whole life for hip dysplasia, and when she's recovering, she's often home from school for weeks or months at a time. And so during that time, she's homeschooled, and she has a tutor that comes to her house. And one of those times, that tutor has her read David Copperfield, sorry. And one of the characters in that book is actually writing a dictionary. And it just really kind of resonates with her because she had never thought of words being written. She'd never thought of the ways that words are created. She kind of just took for granted that they exist. And for her to start thinking about that, it made her realize, like, well, who gets to decide what words mean? Who gets to define them? And on whose terms? And who gets to have a say? And so it became a theme that really just resonated throughout the whole book, that, when I started it, I didn't necessarily realize that was what was going to happen. But really, this is a story about Vero redefining not only words, but even stories she's internalized about herself and her body. And redefining even literal stories. There's the story of the Little Mermaid. There's a story of a Peruvian mermaid myth called Wakachina. Those are also woven throughout this story, because the more and more I wrote, I realized how much words, narratives, myths are just so central to her story. And they really, I guess I was really curious to know, to what extent are the stories that we accept into our bodies, really, like into our lives and into our bodies, are they shaping us? And what if we start shaping them back? And so that's really the where those definitions at the top of each chapter came about. And kind of going back to the excerpt that I just wrote, the top of the definition there is dysplasia. The first definition is an abnormal growth or development. And then Vero's version of it is the state of being displaced inside and outside of your body.
And I found each definition, like reading both like together in that sequence as you're going into each individual chapter, to just be such a powerful moment for the main character and for what was leading us into the story and the plot. And before I keep gushing, I want to go back a little bit and just ask, where did this idea come from? I feel like the more I read, the more I think about books as like tiny little ideas that turn into these huge worlds full of characters. So when did that happen for you? What was that like?
I love that you coin it that way, like tiny little ideas, because I can't actually pinpoint the place when this one idea came to me. I can point to a lot of tiny ideas that I had throughout my life that finally had to kind of percolate for years and years, and then finally kind of came together. So, for example, one of the things that I wrote years ago in my notes, and I thought this would be a poem, but it was just a line, and it was, the memory of my body becomes the language of my body. And again, I didn't know what to do with that, but it's just something that I wanted to figure out where to place it. And I don't know that I placed it literally in here. I think I did, in a not exactly in that way, but it's definitely like a backbone of it. Another way that I think it was just always coming about is that I share so much in common with Vero. This is a book about a Peruvian American teen with hip dysplasia. She was born with hip dysplasia. She in Peru. She came to the U.S. very young. She's had surgeries for much of her childhood, and this all takes place during the summer when before senior year, when she's 17. She lives in a town where there are mermaid performers that perform at a place called Mermaid Cove, and she's obsessed with them. And she really secretly longs to be one, but it is very much like a secret desire, to the point that when a spot opens up, she doesn't know if she'll actually audition, because for one thing, it's something she's a little bit embarrassed about. It's also something that her parents are pretty strict about. Like they have a version of the American dream in mind for her, and her version seems like a fantasy, right, to them. So she's kind of having to go through all these processes of really deciding for herself what her future will look like, and at the same time, she's falling in love. She is discovering what it means to feel safe in her body when it comes to intimacy and sexuality. So there's just a lot going on for her. And again, part of it is that, yes, I share a lot in common with her. I was born with I have hip dysplasia. I had many surgeries growing up, and even recently. And ever since I was a child, I always wrote about it, like in essays, and I remember even trying to publish one when I was like 12, maybe. I sent it to
that's awesome.
magazine. Uh, and they never got published. They weren't very well crafted. So, but I also think that that's really where fiction ended up helping me find the language to write the story, because Veronica's life is not my life. Like her struggle, we share a lot in common, especially with regards to our bodies, right? But I had a really hard time for years, even writing about my body and writing about hip dysplasia. And I don't think I was able to fully start exploring it until I started being able to separate myself just a little bit from it. Create a character like Veronica, who I think in a lot of ways, maybe she's a person who I could have looked up to, her age, or maybe I would have befriended or have loved to have known. And yeah, I don't know if that answers the question of exactly where it came from, but it came from this also place of I'm really fascinated by the idea that, you know, I grew up an immigrant and I have hip dysplasia, and in the word itself is dysplasia, which is just this feeling of not quite fitting in. You know, like hip dysplasia is defined by actually not having your joints aligned properly in your body, in the hip. And for me, it's like those two things have never have always coexisted. You know, like I've been trying to fit in my body. I've been trying to fit in as an immigrant, and it was really hard for a long time to think of how to go about writing for that, or writing about that, because we exist in, well, okay, publishing doesn't often give us the greatest examples of intersectionality. And so for a long time, I really felt like maybe my story and our story, like Vero's, is just way too specific and no one will care. And that's just a really horrible thing to have to think and carry, and like to have that doubt inside of you. So it took me a long time to overcome that. And then once I did, it was just a matter of trying to figure out, like, well, what's the real joy? Like, I don't want to only write about her pain, right? So, the mermaids to me brought together so much of not just her joy and her desires, but also how she wants to be seen in the world, how she wants to move in the world a little more freely, and what it means to feel like you have to almost transform yourself in order to fit in. And what does it mean when maybe she learns that she doesn't want to transform herself?
And I love that you mentioned, you know, the idea of the mermaids and this obsession that Vero has. And, you know, the Mermaid Cove, which was like a whole, like, when you all read this book, I'm talking to the audience, when you all read this book, it's so detailed. It's like so vivid. And so I just, in terms of research for that section, I found that so fascinating, you know, just because I was obsessed with Little Mermaid growing up. I mean, who wasn't, you know, but I found the details of it so great. So could you talk a little bit about the research that might have gone into it, if any?
Oh my God, Lupita, you don't even know. That's a mess. So I started writing this book around, I mean, I don't honestly, like, again, I've been writing it in pieces, but when I started writing it in earnest, because I started and restarted it for years. But when I was finally on track, it was like February 2020.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then it's the first book that sold on proposal. So my publisher was very excited for it. I had only written like 50 pages and my agent sent it off. So suddenly I had this book that had just sold and we had a pandemic and we were on lockdown. And I had made plans to actually, because Mermaid Cove is inspired by Wikiwachi in Central Florida, which is a park in which, a state park in which mermaid performers perform daily. I had made plans to go to their siren camp, where you're there for like 3 days. You train, basically you learn how to be a mermaid, and I was so excited. And then of course that got canceled. So my research for this ended up being very YouTube based. I interviewed people at Wikiwachi, which was very generous of them. I read as much as I could about the history of, like, not just Wikiwachi, but like mermaid parks and performers. And then I read as many legends as I could. And then I got this app called Swimply, which is like an Airbnb for pools. and I rented pools by the hour and let people. I was like, "Hello, I'm going to use your pool because I need to reconnect to the water."
Yeah.
The longing that Vero has for the water, that's a longing I have for the water, but I don't have a pool. So yeah, it was a challenge writing that book during lockdown, or writing any book, this book especially during lockdown.
Yeah, and I feel like I remember you posting about it on Instagram, because if you guys don't follow Natalia, she like just I think it's such an inspiration to be so transparent about the process. Because as a reader, we really sometimes, I feel like from my end, I don't know everything that it goes into imagining in a world, you know. I think sometimes I know, but I don't know. So I found your posts so inspiring in that sense.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I don't often know, like, I don't know. Social media is a tricky thing,
Yeah.
you know. And so it's kind of like, oh, am I sharing too much, or am I not being honest if I'm not more transparent? I don't want to just put this like, um, facade as if everything's perfect, because nothing is for so many of us. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and so just going back to your characters, and really, I connected so much to Vero, who is your main character. And I just want to, I'm curious about the other characters in your process for developing them, and the way they interacted with Vero to really bring her out as, and her story out, which I think is what they did.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Vero has some really, I don't know, I love all the characters in this book. I
Yeah.
know they're all very flawed, but I do think that when you're going to write any character at some point, um, there also has to be love and acceptance, or at least if not acceptance, then freedom of, like, not non-judgment, just to try and understand where they're coming from. But um, Vero has a best friend named Leslie who cheers her on, and just, I love her. I fell in love with Leslie very early on. She's a little quirky. To give you an idea, they like, um, they like Leslie dresses up as Morticia Adams, and Vero wants to dress up as Wednesday, but her parents won't let her. That's just like a little tidbit of their dynamics. Um, Vero's parents are, what is interestingly enough got called overly strict immigrant parents in the jacket copy, right?
Hmm.
Which I found interesting, because yes, they are strict, but I also, you know, I think the strictness comes from her parents knowing that they're in a system that's going to not let their daughters play by the same rules, as other kids. And so yeah, and they don't maybe always make the right decisions. Like, they're very hard on her, and she is often trying to, kind of break free from a lot of the rules they've imposed, and a lot of the restrictions. Um, but I've often thought of all of them really as more victims of the systems that they're in, and a lot of the generational things that get perpetuated, when you come from a background where, like, you're an immigrant, you're a person of color in a country that maybe hasn't always welcomed you. And in Vero's case, she's disabled, and so her body is kind of, her there are so many rules imposed upon her body and how she's supposed to present in the world. And so this idea of assimilation is thrust upon her in these multi-layered ways. Let's see, who else? Dani is Vero's younger sister.
Yeah, she was one of my favorites.
Oh,
And I think she will be everybody's favorite, to be honest. I think she's
oh,
super, super cute. And like the best, like annoying little sister way, but like lovable little sister too.
I do. I love that. I love Dani. And that's the other thing. There are all these ways that I really, again, had to make sure the characters were their own characters, because it's
Yeah.
very easy for people to assume, like, oh, you're approving an immigrant with hip dysplasia, and therefore this is your character, like, or you're the same character. And I didn't want to do that. Like, that I'm actually in my family, I'm the younger sister, and I wanted to make sure. I was like, okay, Vero's going to be the older sister, and let's see how that plays out. You
It
know.
played out so well. I mean, okay, so I'm the eldest sister, daughter. So I was like, this is me. This is the way I would act.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, I
No,
think
no, that's fine.
it played out so well because I feel like I totally connected to her.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And then even like her parents, for example, like I see them as like reflections of so many things that it within society when we are growing up, as immigrants and Latinos, or really not only immigrants who are Latinos, really oftentimes immigrants from all over the world, but the experience I could speak to, right, was Latinx, was as a Latinx person. So there were just certain dynamics that I feel happen at a societal level that can also like seep into the familial dynamics. And so for me, like they're like an expression of that, of like what happens when there's a lot of slut shaming going on in our society, that it also gets perpetuated at that level, or what happens when there's this fear of like what will happen to your child if they don't play by certain rules within like the immigration system, or within a society that's incredibly ableist. So yeah, I just, each character honestly just really spoke to me on their own individual level, and it became really freeing once I was able to create that distance and let them become their own versions of themselves.
Yeah, and I feel like they just connected all so well together. So that was just my favorite thing about one of my favorite things about the book. But I did want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, in which this idea that there might not be space for this story because of publishing and what we know of publishing. And so I was curious about your experience, if you could tell us a little bit about how long it took to get this story out into the world, because when I think about what we need, this is exactly the type of work and stories that we need, especially as Latinx and Latin community, because we always get we get one lane and that's it.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a sense in publishing that there's always this cry for diversity, right? Like, oh, we need diversity, we need books by marginalized authors. But then when we try to really write those truths in all their complexities, suddenly it's like, oh wait, we only meant one marginalization at a time. And it's just like this idea that we can be so much more than one thing, almost feels like it's just too much for our industry to handle. And I think that really, even just internally, for me I internalized that, I think. And that's something that kept me from writing about my disability for a really long time. I think the first time I finally started writing about it, I was invited to be part of a anthology of essays by Sanel Barnes. It was she wanted us to write about being writers in the South, and kind of like decide, well, what we could decide with the theme, and I chose the theme of displacement. And it was really the first time I was writing about my body, aside from the times when I've written about it as a child, right? But it really gave me permission to see this as something that's not at all separate from any other part of my identity. And what happened is that my mom, at one point, had given me a file of a lot of records from when I was younger. And in them were all my medical files, and also my very first passport from when, from when I was born in Peru, so my first passport was my Peruvian passport. And I learned that the first time I come to the US had not actually been when I moved here, but it had been when I was like maybe not even a year old. It had been that my mom brought me here to see an orthopedic surgeon. And to realize that these two parts of me had always been linked really helped me start to realize, like, I don't need to pick apart my identity into all these fragmented pieces. I can understand that those lenses are completely connected. And that, again, just became a really freeing way to write this story. But it took a long time to get there. Like I said, you don't see those. And, people often ask me like, oh, did you the thing is that I didn't try to write this story before in any other way because it wouldn't have made sense. So when people ask me like, oh, did you purposely write it with all these layers of her identity? And I'm like, well, no, it's not that I purposely wrote it that way. It's just that it wouldn't have happened any other way. It wouldn't have existed in any other way. And I couldn't have done it. And maybe for years, that's why I didn't.
Yeah. And you know, your main character Vero reminds me so much of your main character from Running too.
Oh, yeah.
I love the fact that like the themes are in your book are always like Latinas, young Latinas redefining and making space in the world for their true selves. And so could you just talk about like if there's any like threads that you see in your work about, things that you might want to speak on and like, not give, but like, and maybe indirectly give to the Latino community through these books.
Yeah. I don't ever notice them until I've written them.
Yeah.
Right? So I find it so interesting because you're not the first person to kind of draw this correlation between Running and Breathe and Count Back from 10. And yet they're completely different stories,
Yeah.
And the same thing happened to me with my first 2 books for adults. I'm like, oh my God, I'm still kind of dealing with these themes. I just think it's really interesting. When I started writing YA, I think that what I really became fascinated by was that you're at this cusp of you're wanting to define yourself on your own terms, but you've also been shaped by so many things. And what does it look like to break away from some of them? That can be a really hard journey to take, whether or not, because like we're often shaped, by the people we grew up around, and it's often our families. And I make a point to make sure that the parents are very prevalent in YA. And actually, I shouldn't even say I make a point. It comes really naturally, right? But people will often tell me like, oh, it's so interesting because in YA parents aren't often prevalent. And I think, is it the case, or is it mostly, because the way I see is that parents are often very prevalent in a lot of books written about where they're written by and about characters of color, where the parents are really, really prevalent. But again, and I remember growing up and people often telling me, like a lot of my white friends telling me like, oh my God, your parents are so strict.
Yeah.
I was like, yes, they were strict, but I didn't think it was like that strict. And I think I kind of go back to this idea again of like, we're growing up with different rules imposed upon us. Like the world is different for us. And so I guess what I'm fascinated by is like, what does it look like to find your way, through those rules? And then, kind of start to carry your own self of self forward into the next phase of your life.
Yeah. And I feel like just my inner child connects to that, So when I think about both of your books and the way I experienced them and read through them, I was just like, oh my God, this is like little me and what I would want. The same level of power and energy and ability. I mean, eventually I did find out who I was, right? I got here, but the getting there and the telling of that story, I think, is so important. I'm being told that we are running out of time. I don't know where the time went.
That went really fast.
That fast. So if you have any questions in the audience, now's the time. Shoot them to us and I will ask. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for anyone to ask any questions, I'm going to keep asking you questions because, I feel like we can do this forever. But going back to, just the idea of Vero and her ability to, you wrote this beautiful line that I can't stop thinking about. And she was talking about her friend, her American friend, her white friend, and the difference between how they experience punishment, right? Where she says, I would prefer to be grounded than to feel the way my family feels. And so you explain all the weight that comes with disappointing your parents as a child of immigrants. And so could you just talk about, the work that you had to put in to like write about this and really like explore it in such a nuanced way that you do?
Thank you. I think that when you're,
when you're a child of immigrants, whether intentionally or not, you grow up very aware that your family and your parents or whoever came before you sacrificed so much for you to be here. In my case, it wasn't like it was something rubbed in my face at all. But, you know, I saw my parents' sacrifices, and I wanted to somehow express my gratitude. And it becomes like eventually like a thing that you also then fear, oh my God, what if I'm never going to be able to make it worth it? All those sacrifices worth it, right? And so it's a really real thing. In Vero's case, it's different because it's, for her, it's coming more from a place of guilt. It manifests differently in every family, right? So in Vero's case, like her parents are very explicit, really, and saying, here's what we expect from you. We expect certain behaviors. We expect certain, like a certain future for you that follows this American dream. And so she carries a lot of guilt for wanting something different, and she hides it, and she's afraid to voice it because she doesn't want to seem ungrateful. You know, she doesn't want to be seen as like squandering everything that her parents, you know, sacrificed. And it's something that like maybe, you know, Leslie wouldn't necessarily understand, right? And so she struggles a lot with it, of basically seeing how her and her best friend, they live in different worlds, even though they're very close. And even though Leslie's super supportive and understanding, there are parts of her experience that Leslie would never understand.
Yeah, and I found that to be so, I feel like profound, because sometimes there's words, and like you mentioned, as a child of immigrants, sometimes nothing is ever rubbed in your face, right? I've never had anything rubbed in my face, but like being a witness to that, and also knowing that, you know, your parents never had the same opportunities that you have right in front of you. It's like this overwhelming, crushing feeling, right? To do more and to be more and to be everything. Which I think what Vero's trying to do in your book, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, and now that you mention it too, it's probably is one of those things that, kind of going back to an earlier question, that I'm always writing about, right? Because I was thinking about, like, with Everyone Knows You Go Home, I was also thinking a lot about, again, the sacrifices that that are made when you are a child of immigrants. You know, in my, like, kind of like what you just said too, like it was never rubbed in my face either. And actually, in the opposite, I think that my parents tried to protect me a lot from the heart.
Hide it, probably.
Right, and they do it out of love. They do it because they don't want you to feel bad. But children are very perceptive, and we sense things, we see things, and for me at least, it became like this this way of like, my God, what could I ever really do to fully express, you know, or to honor that, really. So yeah, it's just something I'm like endlessly fascinated by, I think, and maybe that's how I end up trying to sort through it. And to see, like, yeah, like if I can't fully ever honor the kinds of sacrifices that my parents made, and other people in my family who immigrated made too, or people who I love, friends, family, community members who I know left behind so much, then maybe I can at least try and witness.
Yeah. I mean, and that's so powerful in itself. Even though, it's tough to witness, right? I think that's the other side, is that it's powerful, but it's tough to be a witness and to bear witness, I think. I wanted to ask, what books made your book possible? Because I know that we had a little like email chat for my newsletter, and you did mention a book that helped in your in your journey to writing this book. So could you talk a little bit about that book and any other books that you felt like made your book possible?
Yeah. So the book I mentioned to Lupita is called Disfigured by Amanda Leduc. Oh, I can never say Leduc. Sorry, I'm really bad with names sometimes, and I should have looked that up.
I think you said it right. I just looked at the name, and I think I would have read it that way too.
But so what happened is that, like I said, I've been thinking about this book for a long time. It took a long time for me to put it to words. There was a version in which I almost thought like, okay, maybe Vero is a volleyball player, because I was a volleyball player in high school. And again, that it turned out it was just way too close to my experience, and I just couldn't articulate. I just couldn't get it. I couldn't get into it. And so when I came to mermaids, which is something that I've been fascinated by since I was a child, it just opened up the whole possibility of this book, and it ended up tying into the Little Mermaid myth, and then I looked up myths about Huacachina, which is a Peruvian mermaid myth. But at the same time, I was also thinking, like, why do these myths fascinate me so much? And then I came upon this book called Disfigured, and it's really all about how, kind of looking back at fairy tales throughout history, folk tales, the ways that they actually are very rooted in and actually perpetuate ableism. And that so often the so-called beasts or creatures in a lot of these fairy tales are either disfigured, or they have what is like a really masked way of actually showing a chronic condition. And again, they just end up vilifying anyone who exists outside of this very narrow way in their body. You know, anyone who is who exists in, like, it's like, I'm trying not to use like our modern terms, because I'm trying to think of like how they, how they describe someone in mythologies and fairy tales. But basically, so because so many fairy tales were also meant as like moral stories that teach you the difference between right or wrong, what ends up happening is that the ideas that you're reinforcing are this idea that disabled bodies and people who are disabled, somehow there's something inherently morally wrong with us. Right. And she just does such an incredible job of showing how these things are not only rooted in ableism, how they manifest, how they're also rooted in anti-Blackness, how they still continue to exist in society today. And so when I read this book, it really, like, and I was in the middle of writing Breathe and Count Back from 10, and it just like made so much of what I was saying, it just made it click and helped me articulate it all so much better, because what it really is like the reason that the Little Mermaid myth and the Huacachina myths are in there, it's because Vero's learning how to question the lies that she has been told. Stories can be really powerful in both good and bad ways. So if she has been internalizing these stories into her life and her body her whole life, and accepting them, like, to me, they weren't any different from all the lies of ableism that we internalize. And so her journey to really having to interrogate them and redefine them, and then choose to tell her own story on her terms and with her own words, that really became what the book, ended up being about. And I know that I really don't know how I would have ever arrived at that without Amanda Leddick's book.
And I love that, because I feel like when we and you connect on Instagram, and we've connected, actually thanks to Duende, we actually got to meet in person, because I attended an event that you had with somebody in the Duende District Bookshop in DC when they were there. And I just feel like we've always connected about books and the power about books. And so I love to know that this book transformed your ability in some way. So I don't want to, again, I feel like I'm conscious of the time. If folks have questions, if not, I'm still here, and I'm excited to ask you even more questions. But I did want to give someone else the opportunity to ask. And while we're waiting, I just wanted to just kind of talk to you and ask about really going back to Vero and the characters and this world that they create, and that they're part of. What was something that you felt yourself like really learned through them and through the story as you were writing it?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. Honestly, I really think I didn't realize I was writing this book during a time when my own body, like my hip dysplasia, was getting worse. And so in a really strange way, like Vero's journey to figuring out how to be the advocate for her own body ended up teaching me how to be an advocate for my body, because I had a really hard time accepting that my hip dysplasia was getting worse. And I wanted to think like, no, it's fine. I'm not in pain. I don't need surgery. Like there's just it was like this really very drawn out process. I had a lot of therapy for it because, I felt like, again, we internalize all these lies about our bodies. And I think I had thought to myself, like, if I can just somehow protect it enough, I won't need, like, my bone won't degenerate and it won't cause all this pain in my body. And of course that was never in my control. But yeah, Vero really, like, writing her journey, like, ended up being the journey that I needed to kind of go through in terms of just being okay with saying what you can and can't do in your body.
Yeah. And I just felt, again, like it was such a powerful story, and like just Vero's entire story is so powerful. It looks like we have a question, by the way. So, we have 2 questions. I will go ahead and read them. Here we go. How do your parents feel about you writing this particular book? Is it hard to speak frankly about your own experience in relation to your book? It's a tough question.
My parents are incredibly proud and so supportive and happy, and I'm so grateful to them because that's how they were my whole life. I think I put this in the acknowledgments. If I didn't articulate it correctly, it's honestly only because my whole life I've been overwhelmed in a good way about how to articulate this to them, which is that they always made me feel safe in my body. It was the world outside of my family, and it wasn't just my parents too. It was my sister, my cousins, everyone who loved me showed me that love by helping me feel safe in my body. The world was not as kind, right? And so there's only so much that love can do. So it's not hard for me to speak frankly about my own experience in relation to the book, because if you notice, I don't often speak about my own experience because I don't want my experience to be conflated with Vero's experience. I don't want people to assume that Vero's story is my story, and that's not to say that Vero and I aren't deeply connected, that there are certainly pieces and huge pieces of me in this book and that I share in common with Vero. But in terms of the characters, what happens in the book, and even just some big and small ways, like I never got to be a mermaid. But no, it's not hard for me. I think what I decided really early on is that I wanted to set boundaries just for my own privacy. Because I think that, I think writers who are marginalized in any way, it's automatically assumed that we're writing almost like verbatim from our life. And I think that's a disservice to our creativity and our imagination. I genuinely didn't make this book about only me because I wanted it to be about something bigger. And I approach all my work that way. I don't try to only write about myself. I try to see where does this fit in the bigger picture and connections to others as well. So I mean, even if, again, Vero's story might not be exactly my story, but I feel it's real. I know her struggles are real, and a lot of the feelings she feels and the things she expresses, I've often felt, even if it hasn't been in the same exact situations with the same exact people.
And honestly, I think that flows right into our next question, which I don't know if you two decided to connect on who was going to ask what, but this flows really well. How do you navigate maintaining a degree of, like you mentioned, your medical privacy in real life while writing honest and genuinely about disability in your book?
So I do write nonfiction, and like I mentioned, the first thing I ever wrote about my hip dysplasia, and really about my body in any substantial way, was nonfiction. And that was super enlightening because, again, it really made me realize, like, how far am I willing to excavate before I hit like a wound that I'm not willing to open for the consumption of someone else. How much are we willing to hurt ourselves for a journey of healing? And so for me, fiction is that vehicle, really. Is that I want to tell a real story. It doesn't have to be factual to be true. And yeah, that medical privacy is important to me. And I mean, I'll share what I'm comfortable sharing, especially when it's with people who, like, with other disabled people who share that experience with me. There's a real bond there. There's a way of seeing each other. And again, though, everyone gets to decide, and that's the thing. And like, I mean, if you even notice in the book, consent is a huge thing too. It's a really big part of that. I think that we have to be willing to draw lines and say, this is as far as I'll go, and expect those things to be respected.
Yeah, and I feel like you do such a great job, even when your book, I think it was right before it came out or right when it came out, I remember seeing the tweet about how you didn't want to be compared and you didn't want to, have your character be like, people say your character is you and you are your character because that's not the reality. And so just as someone witnessing your journey, I think you do such a good job of, like, verbalizing your boundaries. And as someone who needs to also be inspired to consistently push for my own boundaries, I just want to commend you that I think you're doing an amazing job.
Thank you. Thank you, Lupita.
Are we out of time?
We actually have a few minutes.
Okay.
I just want to make sure, does anybody else have any questions before I start blabbing on? I don't want to take up space from anybody. I mean, so what a beautiful conversation the two of you are having. But also just, the way you think, Lupita, I love the way that you take in what you're reading. And then Natalia, all of the things that you're writing about are just so important, and you're answering questions for yourself, I think, but also questions that maybe so many people don't know how to ask, especially like the bodily question. I loved what you said about, fairy tales, just like where anti-Blackness and anti, disability, just like anything that any, and I was wondering, like, were those more like European or were they like cross cultural? Like, I'm fascinated because I'm just fascinated by these kinds of things. Like, do you think they're, I didn't know if they were like specifically referring to like Eurocentric fairy tales
In the book, you mean?
In the book, and like kind of what you were thinking about in that way.
Well, I think in the book I was talking about in Disfigured, if I'm remembering correctly, the majority of them were more Eurocentric. And I, that's also because of how prevalent they get centered in our culture and across culture. But yeah, like for my book, I really was also curious to learn about different stories and, like even just learning about the Huacachina myth. One thing that gets brought up in Breathe is just how much and actually I find it interesting in a lot of Latinx myths, we have some version of the Huacachina myth because it has to do with her grief and her tears. So like we have these obsessions with like crying women.
Women that lose their children.
Yeah.
And their minds.
Exactly. And somehow like that just alters their entire reality and being, and it ends up being the reason for why they are either like haunting a place or perpetually like doomed to it, or I found that really interesting because to me, I was also exploring in this book like how we expect disabled people to just endure pain, and how we glorify pain, how we equate it with strength, as if strength is the most the best quality and characteristic to possess, as if it's the most coveted thing that we could have. And so again, just kind of going back to the way that these tears and this pain is always glorified, it also really created a framework for this book.
It's so fascinating. Well, I think about like, when you the body and like I mean, where it's especially prevalent with Indigenous and Black people, where like you're not like your pain is not, it doesn't matter.
Mm.
You know, when I think, for example, Black women when they're pregnant and their prenatal care is they're not treated as bodies that can feel pain or that may have like, and I feel like that's so much, and especially like here in New Mexico. I mean, I gave birth in a hospital where just months later they targeted Indigenous women taking and testing their babies without their consent.
Yeah.
You know, and like that ownership of our body. So I love everything that you're saying, because I especially feel like I love that because you talk a lot. I think about being Indigenous Peruvian, and I don't think that many of us talk about there's that sort of erasure of in Latinx, like sort of Latinidad, is that we erase our Indigenous and Black parts. And this is just me, like I'm constantly trying to interrogate my own anti-Blackness and how do I pull that out of myself, because we all carry this. Most of us carry Indigenous and African ancestry, and are colonized to the point where we force the Eurocentrism to the front, and that is so detrimental to us health wise, mentally, physically. But those myths, I feel, what I think people call, obviously I'm thinking a lot about this with Ingrid's book, and somebody pointed out, like there's not any Black people in there, and that was I needed to hear that too, and like magical realism, the idea of magical realism in literary fiction is that what if that's just who we are, and why do we have to accept that that's just a thing that's made up? So when you're writing about like this, like mermaids, I'm thinking about like the Taino were in southern Florida, or the Yamaya, from Western African culture, and those mermaids, and these are just a part of us, and one way or another, even though if they've been hidden or whatever. And so I love that your book is bringing that to the surface and interrogating it more, because I think we need more writing like that very much. But I also understand that, like, even when you're dealing with like publishing with white, that one dimensionality that they want to force upon us, but I think is particularly detrimental to the Latinx community, because there is no one dimensionality to us at all.
Yeah, and that erasure is just so. It's not just erasure in stories and myths, right? It's erasure like in violence, and even you mentioning, I mean, Black women have the highest maternal mortality rate, and if I remember correctly, also like Black babies also have some of the highest mortality rates as well, because medical racism is a very, very real thing, and so it's not, these aren't just myths and stories that we talk about. They evolve and they have real implications, manifestations in real life.
Absolutely. All right, I know I'm always taking it to like super serious, like we need to talk about our anti-Blackness and our anti-indigeneity, like, but like I think you do that all the time, and you do it so well and so beautifully. So thank you both so much for being in the space, for having such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you to the ward. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I love you all. You're amazing.
I just want to say it was an honor, Natalia. Thank you so much for writing. Truly, like, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, my little teenage girl heart, the inside of me. Thanks you so much.
Well, thank you, Lupita. I always love talking about books with you, so it's an honor to be able to talk about one of my books, and like it's just an honor to know that you like lent your time and thoughts, because you're so thoughtful in how you talk about books. So I appreciate it so much. And Alyssa and Angela, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of love in the chat. So thank you all for joining us. I personally look forward to these events. Lupita, your questions are like on point. So major kudos. Thank you, Angela. It's such a beautiful partnership between Duende District and the Word. Learn more about us at our website, and definitely make sure that you purchase Natalia's book. And thank you for joining. And we will keep you posted on some upcoming events. Adiós, besos y abrazos.
Thank you, everyone.